After the 1860 presidential election, the United States was teetering towards the brink of war. Abraham Lincoln, a Republican from Illinois who was against slavery, had won, taking advantage of a split in the Democratic Party. In many slave-holding states, talk of secession to prevent the abolition of slavery was sweeping through the region. In North Carolina, the state was divided fairly evenly between those who favored secession and those who opposed it. Much of the eastern Piedmont and western coastal plain, where there were many plantations and slaves, were pro-secessionist. Others, such as those along the coast and in the mountains, where there were few slaves, were in favor of giving Lincoln a chance. During the 1860 election, most coastal North Carolina counties actually nominated John Bell, a strong Unionist, from the Constitutional Union Party. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. They were followed by Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas in January and February, forming the Confederate States of America. On January 9, 1861, an armed pro-secession group calling themselves the Cape Fear Militiamen seized Fort Caswell and Fort Johnston outside of Wilmington. When he heard the news, North Carolina Governor John Ellis ordered the men to return the forts to the U.S. Army. On April 15, 1861, Confederate artillery batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, South Carolina, in the first battle of the Civil War. In response, President Lincoln called for the states to raise 75,000 volunteer troops to restore the Confederate States to the Union. Governor Ellis wrote Lincoln, telling him you can get no troops from North Carolina. In April, Lincoln ordered a blockade of southern ports by the U.S. Navy, including those of Virginia and North Carolina, which had not yet seceded. Governor Ellis then ordered militia to seize Fort Johnston and Fort Caswell, Fort Macon outside of Beaufort, the U.S. Arsenal in Fayetteville, and the U.S. Mint in Charlotte. All of these buildings surrendered without bloodshed. On May 20, 1861, a convention of secession assembled at the state capitol in Raleigh. That day, North Carolina officially seceded from the Union. After seceding, North Carolina began to construct fortifications along the coast as well as strengthening existing forts. Forts were constructed at Wilmington, Oregon Inlet, Ocracoke, and Cape Hatteras. Troops were also sent to Hatteras to protect the 59-year-old lighthouse, which predated the famous lighthouse seen at Hatteras today. North Carolina also acquired a small fleet of 4 gunboats, which were quickly turned over to Confederate control. These ships were called the Mosquito Fleet. Hatteras had a strategic location along the Atlantic seaboard, and during the summer of 1861, 100 blockade runners passed through Hatteras Inlet. One of the boats of the Mosquito Fleet, the Sidewheeler Winslow, captured 16 Union ships in a period of 6 weeks off of Hatteras. Minor naval skirmishes between Union gunboats and ships of the Mosquito Fleet continued throughout the summer of 1861. Due to the presence of Confederate commerce raiders at Hatteras and the use of the inlet by blockade runners, the Union decided to mount an operation to capture the forts. On August 26, 1861, a Union fleet of 8 warships and 2 transports set sail for Hatteras. The landing force consisted of 860 men under the command of General Benjamin Butler. The attack on Hatteras was to be one of the first combined operations in the history of the U.S. military. For one of the first times in history, Army and Navy units would be cooperating in an assault on an enemy position. The next day, the Union fleet arrived off of Cape Hatteras. The Confederate forts in the area were Fort Clark and the larger Fort Hatteras. They were defended by only 350 men, and the forts together mounted only 21 cannon against the Union fleet's 151 guns. On the morning of August 28th, the Union warships opened fire on Fort Clark. The defenders fired back, but a shortage of ammunition limited their fire. By mid-morning the Union transports had begun offloading troops. Unfortunately, bad weather put a stop to this after only 300 men had been landed. In the meantime, after running out of ammunition, the Confederates had spiked the cannons of Fort Clark and retreated towards Fort Hatteras. The Union troops ashore quickly seized control of Fort Clark. The next morning, the Union fleet began bombarding Fort Hatteras. Most of the fort's powder was wet, and their shells were defective. Union shelling started a fire that threatened the main powder magazine. With almost no hope of reinforcement, the Confederates ran up a white flag and surrendered the fort. After the victory at Hatteras, much of the Union force sailed off, leaving Colonel Rush Hawkins in command of the remaining garrison. Hawkins was the commander of the 9th New York Zouaves, so called because of their brightly colored uniforms that mimicked those of French soldiers in Algeria. Hawkins commanded only 946 men and feared a Confederate attack. He divided his small force, sending one group northwards past Fort Clark to warn of an impending attack. After receiving reinforcements, in late September, he sent these men north to the village of Chicamacomico, 40 miles north of Fort Hatteras. It was not until after a Union ship that attempted to bring supplies to the Chicamacomico garrison was captured by the Confederates did Hawkins realize the danger of dividing his small force. He quickly ordered the troops back to Hatteras. By the time his orders arrived on October 4th, it was too late. The Chicamacomico garrison was already under attack by Confederates from Roanoke Island. The plan called for North Carolina troops to land south of the village, while a Georgia regiment landed to the north, surrounding the Federal garrison. Their plans were upset when the North Carolina troops ran aground in their barges, tipping off the Federals. They withdrew hastily, with the Confederates hard on their heels in what became known as the Chicamacomico races. The chase continued all day until night forced the men to camp in the dunes. Hearing about what had happened, Colonel Hawkins quickly sent reinforcements and a gunboat to counterattack the next morning, chasing the Confederates all the way back to Chicamacomico. In the end, the Confederates retreated to Roanoke, and the Federals to Hatteras. It had almost ended in a disaster for the Union, but casualties were light on both sides. Colonel Hawkins was to be relieved of his command for his major blunder.